It began with something seemingly insignificant: the ring. Kimberly's wedding band, the one she would absent-mindedly twist when lost in thought, had vanished. Not misplaced, not left behind, completely gone. One evening, as we sat together on the couch watching TV, I noticed her bare hand. The sight unsettled me. She'd always taken pride in that ring. It wasn't flashy, just a platinum band with a diamond that caught the light in a subtle, elegant way. When not on her finger, it typically rested on the coffee table, the kitchen counter, or the drawer beside her bed. But this time, it was nowhere to be found. "Where's your ring?" I asked, aiming for a casual tone. She didn't even glance up. Her focus was glued to her phone yet again, a source of constant irritation for me. "Oh, it's at the jeweler's," she said quickly, her tone too brisk to feel genuine. "Needed to get it resized." I raised an eyebrow. "Resized? After 9 years?" She shrugged, offering me an irritated look, as though I were the one being unreasonable. "Yeah, fingers change, don't they?" she replied defensively. Though I dropped the subject, her explanation nagged at me. Her hands hadn't changed. There'd been no significant weight gain or loss, no visible transformation. Kimberly was as she'd always been, though lately she'd been more particular about her appearance. Extra hours at the gym, experimenting with new looks in the mirror. At the time, I dismissed it as self-care or a new hobby, but the missing ring lingered in the back of my mind like a quiet warning. 2 weeks later, the first true red flag appeared. Kimberly mentioned she'd be out late with a networking group. Normally, this wouldn't have raised suspicion. I'd always trusted her to go out, meet people, and attend events. But the way she said it this time felt off. "That's cool," I replied casually, testing the waters. "Which group?" Her answer came too fast, almost rehearsed. "Just some coworkers. You wouldn't know them." I hadn't asked for a detailed guest list, but her curt tone unsettled me. Kimberly, who once loved to share every detail of her day, now sounded distant, even evasive. Something wasn't right. That Saturday, while she was out, I decided to dig a little deeper. A small investigation wouldn't hurt, I told myself. I flipped through her planner, noted her favorite new haunts, and pieced together where this supposed networking group might meet. It didn't take long to find her. The moment I stepped into the bar, my stomach turned. Kimberly wasn't with coworkers or acquaintances. She was leaning into a man I didn't recognize, her hand resting casually on his arm. Her laughter rang out, full and uninhibited in a way I hadn't heard in years. I froze, struggling to process the scene before me. It felt like I had stumbled into someone else's nightmare. And then she brushed his cheek with her hand. The gesture was so intimate, so unguarded, that it left no doubt. Something broke inside me. I didn't confront her, not then. Instead, I stayed in the shadows, watching their interactions, the closeness, the way she leaned into him, speaking with her lips near his ear. It wasn't just infidelity. It was familiarity, comfort, ease. When she kissed him, I left. My head swirled as I drove aimlessly for hours, the scene replaying endlessly in my mind. By the time I returned home, Kimberly was already in bed, pretending nothing had happened. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, its screen lighting up with notifications. For the first time in our relationship, I gave in to the temptation to check it. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages. And there it was. His name, Daniel. The texts were blatant and left no room for doubt. Flirty exchanges, plans to meet again, jokes that hinted at inside knowledge. But one message gutted me completely. "Can't wait to see you again tonight. You're worth the risk." The next morning, I was up before her. I sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window with a coffee cup in hand, my mind racing. Confronting her outright felt too simple, too direct. She didn't deserve the clarity of an argument. I wanted her to feel the discomfort. When she finally came downstairs, her hair was messy, and she wore one of my old sweatshirts over leggings, playing the role of the carefree wife. "Morning," she greeted cheerfully, pouring herself coffee and humming a light tune as though everything were fine. "How was the networking event last night?" I asked evenly, my tone casual. Her hand faltered ever so slightly before she turned to face me, her expression controlled. Oh, it was fine, long, just a lot of boring small talk, you know how it is. Right, I said, leaning back in my chair as if disinterested. Funny thing, I was in the area last night. Thought I'd swing by, but I couldn't find you. Her smile wavered, just enough for me to notice. Oh, we left early, went somewhere quieter to talk. Her lies came effortlessly, but watching her spin them made me sick. Sure, I said, letting the silence stretch as I sipped my coffee. Her gaze flicked away, landing on the chair near the door. There, crumpled carelessly, was the red dress she'd worn the night before. Its collar bore a faint smudge, lipstick. Kimberly only ever wore nude shades. I stood, walked over and picked up the dress. Her posture stiffened as she watched me. You're getting careless, I said quietly, my tone sharp and deliberate. She spun around, her face a mask of feigned confusion. What's that supposed to mean? I held up the dress, pointing to the smudge. It's not yours, is it? For the briefest moment, panic crossed her face, but she recovered quickly, letting out a hollow laugh. Seriously? You're accusing me over a stain? It's wine, from dinner. Don't be ridiculous. She snatched the dress from my hand, her tone dripping with condescension. Of course. Wine, I replied flatly, letting her think she'd dodged the accusation. But her reaction had given her away. That afternoon, while she showered, I decided to search further. Her laptop was logged in, her email open, and there it was, an exchange with Daniel. Flirtations, plans, and undeniable proof of her betrayal. The specifics of their outings, the arrangements for the next one. This wasn't some passing flirtation. He had embedded himself into her daily existence. When Kimberly emerged from the bathroom, I closed the laptop in silence. Wrapped in a towel, droplets slid down her wet hair and landed on the polished wood floor. She stopped short when she saw me on the bed, her laptop resting beside me. I didn't greet her. I didn't speak. My gaze met hers, cold, unwavering. Her eyes darted to the laptop, her throat shifting with a tense swallow. What? She asked, her attempt at innocence falling flat. Rising slowly, I brushed past her, my voice low and deliberate. You'll understand soon enough. She called after me, her tone tinged with alarm, but I kept walking. I wasn't going to give her the chance to craft an explanation. The stage was set, and she had no idea she'd already lost the upper hand. For the rest of the day, Kimberly trailed me, her unease palpable, her usual breezy demeanor replaced by a visible tension that hung between us like a heavy mist. Her questions came endlessly. What's wrong? Why are you acting like this? Each one carried a growing desperation. She knew something had shifted, but the uncertainty of what I might know kept her off balance. That uncertainty was my edge. By the time the clock struck 8 p.m., she announced she was heading to the grocery store. I barely glanced at her, muttering a distracted acknowledgement while pretending to be engrossed in a football game I hadn't been following. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I moved. Her laptop alone wasn't enough. I needed irrefutable proof, something that would dismantle any defense she could muster. I went straight to her dresser, the one she always kept immaculately organized, her pride in its neatness unmistakable. But now I saw it as something else, a vault of her lies. It didn't take long to find. Tucked inside an old shoebox beneath layers of unworn scarves was a second phone. My pulse raced as I held it in my hands, wondering how I'd overlooked this. Turning it on, I discovered it wasn't even password protected. Careless Kimberly, sloppy. The device was a treasure trove, messages, photos, locations. At the top of her chats was Daniel's name, pinned like a trophy. Their conversation unfolded like a twisted love story. Nicknames, getaways they'd planned together, destinations she'd never mentioned to me. The photos were worse. Selfies of them at bars, the gym, inside his car. One in particular sent a wave of fury through me. Kimberly in that red dress, his arm draped possessively around her. The anger was visceral, nearly overpowering. I wanted to hurl the phone, break it into pieces, but I resisted. Instead, I took screenshots of everything and sent them to myself. This wasn't just about confronting her anymore. It was about taking back control. When Kimberly returned half an hour later, arms full of grocery bags, she acted as if nothing was amiss. She even hummed a tune while setting a carton of eggs on the counter. "How was the store?" I asked evenly. She glanced at me, likely trying to gauge my mood. "It was fine," she replied. "They didn't have my almond milk, though." I tapped my fingers lightly on the counter, nodding. "You left your laptop open earlier." Her hands froze mid-motion, a can of soup in one hand, a loaf of bread in the other. Quickly, she forced a nervous laugh. "Oh? Was I working on something?" I didn't reply. Instead, I held up the second phone, letting it dangle between my fingers. The color drained from her face. "Where did you find that?" she demanded, her voice sharp, her mask of innocence gone. "Take a guess," I replied, leaning against the counter. "Better yet, why don't you tell me how long you've been hiding it? Or did you think I wouldn't notice?" Her mouth opened, then closed as she struggled for words. Finally, she stammered, It's not what you think." "Oh, it's exactly what I think," I shot back, my voice rising, fueled by the fury I'd bottled up all day. Slamming the phone onto the counter, I added, "You've been sneaking around with Daniel, lying to me, and you didn't even bother covering your tracks. How stupid do you think I am?" Her eyes darted between the phone and me, searching for a lifeline, but her usual sharp retorts failed her. Desperation overtook her as she lashed out. "Maybe if you'd actually paid attention to me, I wouldn't have needed Daniel." The words hit like a slap, but I didn't flinch. I stepped closer, my voice cold and cutting. "Don't you dare try to shift this onto me. This was your choice. You did this." For a moment, the silence was deafening, broken only by her shallow breaths. Then, she snatched the phone from the counter and stormed out of the kitchen, muttering something about needing space. I let her go, allowing her to believe she still had some semblance of control. While she fumed upstairs, likely messaging Daniel, I prepared my next move. The slam of the bedroom door reverberated through the house, but I stayed rooted in the kitchen. My fists clenched so tightly my knuckles ached. She thought she could regroup, manipulate the situation to suit her. Not this time. When the moment presented itself, I'd managed to swipe the phone back without her noticing. Now, as I held it, I scrolled through their messages, determined to learn more about him. Who was this man who thought he could intrude on my life? Their chat started innocently enough, discussing some shared project. Then I saw his full name in an email Kimberly had forwarded to him. That was all I needed. Opening my laptop, I searched for him on every platform I could think of: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. The results were predictable. Daniel was a caricature of himself, his Instagram brimming with gym selfies, overpriced meals, and motivational quotes about living boldly. One highlight reel, aptly titled My People, confirmed my suspicions. Kimberly appeared in several clips. In one, she laughed as Daniel filmed her too close. In another, she perched on his lap at a party, her laughter carefree. The captions made my blood boil. "This one's trouble, but worth it. Taking risks has its rewards." The audacity was staggering. Daniel didn't fear discovery, and Kimberly hadn't even tried to keep him hidden. She flaunted their relationship as if I didn't exist. I unearthed more on LinkedIn: his job, his office, his gym. As the pieces fell into place, so did my plan. Kimberly's betrayal was bad enough, but Daniel had inserted himself into my life, and for that, he was fair game. A direct confrontation would give them the chance to paint themselves as victims. I had a better idea. No, I wasn't going to confront their charade head-on. That would have been too easy. Instead, I was determined to dismantle it, methodically and thoroughly. When Kimberly emerged from the bedroom pretending to quench her thirst with a glass of water, I was already busy at work. Every incriminating piece of evidence, screenshots of their messages, photos, and captions, was being forwarded to myself for safekeeping. Sitting at the dining table, my fingers flew across the keyboard as she glanced at me, suspicion clouding her expression. "Still sulking?" she asked, her voice laced with fake concern. I didn't bother looking up, my focus unbroken. "Oh, this is just the beginning," I replied, my tone ice cold. That silenced her. She lingered for a moment before retreating back to the bedroom. Good. Let her stew in the discomfort. By the time the clock struck midnight, I had compiled a dossier on Daniel that would put any professional investigator to shame. His workplace, hobbies, routines, everything I needed to disrupt his carefully ordered life was in my grasp. The first step was simple. His workplace's client-facing email directory was publicly accessible. Crafting an email to his boss was almost too easy. I carefully worded it to sound measured, professional, and full of plausible deniability. Subject: concern about employee behavior. Dear manager's name, I hope this message finds you well. Recently, I stumbled upon Instagram posts involving one of your employees, Daniel last name, that raised concerns about conduct unbecoming of your organization's standards. The content appears to suggest inappropriate relationships tied to the workplace, and I thought it prudent to bring this to your attention. If further details are needed, please don't hesitate to reach out. Best regards, a concerned individual. I left it unsigned. There was no need to declare myself. Daniel would know exactly who was behind the storm when it arrived. The satisfaction of hitting send was electric. They both thought I'd stay silent, but they had underestimated me. The first domino had fallen, and I was eager to see the rest collapse. The next morning, Kimberly acted as though nothing had happened. She breezed into the kitchen wearing her silk robe, humming a carefree tune, and grabbed a mixing bowl. "How about pancakes?" she asked with a bright smile, as if the night before had been a bad dream. I stared at her, almost in disbelief at her audacity. She was playing the part of the perfect spouse, pretending our marriage wasn't fractured beyond repair. I felt a laugh rise in my throat but held it back. "No thanks," I said flatly, folding my arms. "I lost my appetite about the same time you decided Daniel's lap was a better seat than the one at our anniversary dinner." The whisk in her hand stopped mid-stir, clinking against the bowl. Her face stiffened as she turned to face me. "Are we seriously doing this again?" she snapped. "You're imagining things. How many times do I have to say it? He's just a friend." The nerve of her was astonishing. I met her gaze with a calm that was almost unnerving. "A friend? You mean the type who tells you how much he loves holding you, or the kind who sits you on his lap while you wear the dress I gave you for our anniversary?" Each word was like a dagger, and her face turned pale. Still, she recovered quickly, her defenses snapping into place. "So now you're spying on me? Going through my private messages? That's a massive breach of trust." The hypocrisy was almost laughable. "Breach of trust?" I repeated, standing up. "You're cheating on me, and I'm the one breaking trust? Do you even hear yourself?" She rolled her eyes, the veneer of calm cracking. "You're overreacting," she said sharply. "You've blown this so far out of proportion. Daniel and I haven't even—" "Stop!" I cut her off, my voice sharp as steel. "Don't finish that sentence. I've seen everything. The texts, the photos. Lie to yourself if you need to, but don't insult me by lying to my face." For a moment, she looked utterly speechless. Her mouth opened, then closed, as if searching for words. Finally, she crossed her arms and said coldly, "Fine. What do you want me to say? That I made a mistake? That I was lonely? You're not perfect either. You're always so busy with work, with everything else. When was the last time you really paid attention to me?" Ah, there it was, her attempt to shift the blame onto me. "Don't," I warned, my voice dangerously low. "Don't try to make this about me. You had options, Kimberly. You could have talked to me, told me you were unhappy. You could have ended this marriage. But instead you lied, you snuck around, and you humiliated me." Her jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw cracks forming in her composure. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "It wasn't supposed to go this far." I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Oh, really? And how far was it supposed to go? Was I supposed to turn a blind eye while you played house with Daniel? Or were you just biding your time until you could leave me?" Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the counter. Our eyes darted to it simultaneously. I didn't miss the way her face tightened when Daniel's name flashed on the screen. "Go ahead," I said, motioning to the phone. "Answer it. Better yet, put it on speaker. Let's hear what your friend has to say." She hesitated, her hand hovering over the phone before she rejected the call and shoved the device into her pocket. I let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, that's what I thought. She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. "Oh, and by the way," I said, grabbing my coffee mug and heading for the door, "you might want to warn your boyfriend. His boss is about to have a very enlightening morning." Her eyes widened in panic. "What did you do?" she demanded. I smiled coolly, just making sure Daniel faces a little accountability. You know, since he's such a professional. I didn't wait to see her reaction. Walking out the door, I left her clutching her phone like a lifeline. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But the cracks were spreading, and I intended to shatter their entire fantasy. The fallout was immediate. By noon, Daniel's Instagram profile was wiped clean. No selfies, no captions, just a blank slate. Watching it crumble was oddly satisfying. Meanwhile, Kimberly spent the day pacing the bedroom, glued to her phone. She thought shutting the door would keep her frantic calls private, but the thin walls betrayed her. "What do you mean he knows? Who told him?" "I don't care if your boss is furious. Fix it." Her voice, sharp and desperate, was music to my ears. They had underestimated me, and now the pieces of their perfect little game were crashing down around them. This was never supposed to reach anyone else. Yet here we are. A sly grin tugged at the corners of my lips. It's amazing how swiftly the mighty can fall. By the time night descended, Kimberly finally showed up. Her guarded expression was a mask, but her sharp, accusatory gaze betrayed her. Her posture was stiff, her shoulders squared for battle. Clearly she was ready to fight. But so was I. She planted herself in the middle of the living room, clutching her phone like it was some kind of lifeline or weapon. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice cold and cutting. I barely glanced up from my laptop, still scrolling lazily through my emails. "What needed to be done?" I said evenly, leaning back in my chair. Daniel thought he could play games, so I decided to raise the stakes. Her jaw clenched, but for a fleeting moment, something else flashed across her face. Fear. "You had no right," she hissed. "This was between us. You shouldn't have dragged someone else into this." I stood slowly, pressing my hands against the edge of the table. "You made it his problem the moment you chose to cheat," I said, my tone sharp. "Don't act like you're some innocent bystander. You created this disaster, and now you'll deal with the fallout." She stepped closer, her voice lowering to a venomous whisper. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Daniel could lose his job over this." I raised an eyebrow, letting the weight of her accusation linger. "Good. Maybe he'll learn not to mess with someone else's wife." The silence that followed was electric. Kimberly's face contorted, her emotions twisting between fury, shame, and desperation. Finally, she turned away, running her fingers through her hair. "You're a vindictive bastard," she muttered. I shrugged. "And you're a liar. Looks like we're both getting a clearer picture of who we really are." The tension in the room was thick when her phone buzzed. She ignored it at first, but when it buzzed again, she hesitated. Then, unable to resist, she glanced at the screen and froze. Her reaction told me everything I needed to know. "Go ahead," I said, gesturing toward her phone. "Answer it, or are you too afraid of what he'll say?" She hesitated for only a moment before hitting the green button and lifting the phone to her ear. "What?" she snapped, her voice hushed but angry. I stayed put, watching her every move. "No, I don't know how he found out," she hissed into the phone, pacing back and forth. "I'm handling it. Stop calling me." She hung up abruptly, her composure unraveling. Turning to me, she yelled, "Do you think this is some kind of game? Ruining someone's life makes you feel powerful?" I let out a harsh laugh. "You want to talk about ruining lives? You wrecked ours the moment I wasn't enough for you. Don't stand there playing the victim while I clean up the mess you made." She threw her hands in the air, exasperated. "What do you want from me? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I got caught. I'm sorry you weren't interesting enough to keep me around. There. Happy now?" Her words hit harder than I'd like to admit, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I smiled coldly, detached. "Thank you," I said. She frowned, her confusion evident. "For what?" "For showing me exactly who you are," I replied, brushing past her. "Now I don't have to feel bad about what comes next." She called after me, but I didn't stop. My focus had shifted. This wasn't just about Kimberly or Daniel anymore. It was about ensuring I came out of this stronger, leaving them to face the chaos they'd created. And I was only getting started. Kimberly unraveled faster than I expected. Her usually composed exterior crumbled, replaced by nervous energy and hurried whispered phone calls. Every time I entered the room, she stiffened, lowering her voice as if she still had secrets to protect. But she didn't realize I was already several steps ahead. By midweek, the cracks in Daniel's life became visible. A quick check of LinkedIn showed he was now on leave. Casual inquiries with mutual connections painted a grim picture. He'd been hauled into an HR meeting after someone anonymously submitted damning evidence of inappropriate behavior. He'd left the meeting shaken, and whispers of an affair with a married client, Kimberly, were spreading like wildfire. Kimberly stayed silent, maintaining her usual facade as though pretending nothing had changed would fix anything. But I wasn't content with just rumors. I wanted something concrete. That evening, while Kimberly went for one of her so-called reflective walks, I searched her second phone. Her messages with Daniel were as incriminating as I'd hoped. They'd arranged a final goodbye, but their flirtatious tone suggested it was anything but. The time, date, and location were all there. Friday night, 8 p.m. at a cozy downtown cafe. Perfect. The next day, I set my plan into motion, ensuring every detail was accounted for. On Friday, Kimberly was visibly on edge but determined. She avoided my gaze all afternoon, making it clear she intended to follow through. Around 6:30, she announced she was heading to a work dinner, slipping on heels and grabbing her bag. Her overly casual tone reeked of guilt. I simply nodded, watching her leave. Once her car disappeared down the street, I grabbed my keys and followed. Parking a block away from the cafe, I waited. Kimberly arrived first, slipping inside. Daniel was already there, his unease apparent even from where I sat. Kimberly joined him, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. I won't lie, it stung. Watching her look at him with that same warmth she once reserved for me made my stomach churn. But I shoved the emotions aside. This wasn't the time for weakness. From my car, I snapped photos of their reunion. They weren't exactly discreet. Kimberly leaned in, her hand brushing his arm, her body language undeniably intimate. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed jumpy, his eyes darting around the room like he was waiting for an ambush. He wasn't wrong, but I didn't confront them. Not yet. I wanted them to believe they'd gotten away with it. After Kimberly left, I trailed Daniel to his suburban rental. Parking a few houses down, I watched as he entered his dimly lit home. Once the lights flicked on, I made my move. When Daniel opened the door, his face was pale, his energy drained. The instant he saw me, panic overtook him. "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside before he could even think of shutting the door. He stammered, his facade cracking instantly. "I don't know what you think." "Save it," I cut him off. "I'm not here to argue. This isn't a discussion, it's a warning." My words struck with the force of a thunderstorm. He stared back, his expression shifting between alarm and disbelief. I didn't relent. "You're already out of a job." I leaned closer, my voice low and deliberate, slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "And don't fool yourself into thinking this is over. Stay away from my wife. Am I clear?" Daniel's hands shot up defensively, his words tumbling out in a frantic mess. "Listen, I didn't mean to. Did I ask for your excuses?" I cut him off, each syllable cold and unyielding. He nodded quickly, his face pale and drawn. "Yes, I understand," he mumbled. I held his gaze, letting the weight of my words sink in, then turned and left without a backward glance. Behind me, Daniel remained rooted to the spot, a shadow of the man who thought he could tear apart my life without consequences. At home, Kimberly was already in bed. Whether she was asleep or simply pretending didn't matter. Fine. Let her cling to the illusion that she'd escaped unscathed. Tomorrow would mark the start of the next chapter in this reckoning, and she wouldn't see it coming. The morning after her little meeting with Daniel, I woke before dawn, my mind sharp despite the early hour. The sky was barely beginning to lighten, soft shades of gray and lavender brushing the horizon. This wasn't just about retribution anymore. It was about unmasking the lies, exposing the truth she thought she'd buried. While Kimberly slept upstairs, I set my plan in motion. My first target was her closet, a shrine to her vanity, lined with designer handbags and perfectly arranged scarves. In one of her cherished totes, I'd slipped a planted receipt the night before. It was from a cafe, Daniel's unmistakable signature scrawled at the bottom. I retrieved it and placed it conspicuously on the kitchen counter, where it would be impossible for her to miss. She emerged around 9:30, bleary-eyed and wrapped in an oversized sweater. She mumbled a half-hearted greeting as she reached for her coffee, then froze. Her hand hovered over the receipt. The shift in her demeanor was immediate, her body stiff as she picked it up. "What's this?" she asked, her voice brittle with an attempt at casualness. Beneath it, unease quivered. Without looking up from the newspaper I was pretending to read, I replied with cool indifference. "Something from your bag, I think." Her fingers trembled as she scanned the slip of paper. By the time her eyes landed on the signature, the blood had drained from her face. "Why were you going through my things?" she demanded, her tone sharp with indignation. "I wasn't," I said lightly, though my words carried a sharp undercurrent. "I was just verifying your work dinner." Looks like I got my answer. Her face twisted in anger as she slapped the receipt onto the counter. "This is insane. You're spying on me now, digging through my stuff like some jealous— Enough." My voice sliced through her protests, cold and commanding. "This isn't about me. It's about you, about your lies, and this time you didn't even bother hiding them." Her jaw tightened, and for once she didn't try to deny it. Cornered, her bravado crumbled. "What do you want?" she snapped, her voice trembling. "An apology? Fine, I'm sorry, I hurt you. Happy now, can we move on?" I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and devoid of humor. "Move on? You think we can just sweep this under the rug? Do you even understand the damage you've done? Or are you so lost in your lies that you can't see it?" She sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping as she muttered, "I never meant for it to get this far." "But it did," I said, my tone firm. "So what's next? What are you going to do about it?" She looked up at me, tears brimming in her eyes. For a fleeting moment I thought I saw genuine remorse. Then she spoke, and whatever hope I had shattered. "I don't know," she said softly. "I don't even know if I want to fix this." Her words hit like a fist to the gut. "You don't know?" I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I didn't plan for this," she murmured, "but I've been unhappy for so long, and I don't think you've been happy either." Her confession was a dagger to the heart. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a rejection of everything we'd built together. I stood, moving with deliberate precision. "Thank you for clearing that up," I said, my tone icy. "It makes what comes next much easier." Her eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed my jacket and walked out, leaving her alone with her guilt and the wreckage of our life. I drove aimlessly, the steady hum of the engine the only thing grounding me. Her words reverberated in my mind. "I don't think I want to fix this." By the time I reached a quiet park, the sun hung high in the sky. Sitting on a worn bench, I pulled out my phone. The evidence I'd gathered, screenshots, photos, the receipt, was all there. My finger hovered over the delete button for a moment. Part of me wanted to walk away, but then I thought of her betrayal, her arrogance, her utter disregard. No, she needed to face the truth. I opened the messaging app and started composing. The recipients included Kimberly, Daniel, her family, and our closest friends. The subject line was simple: the truth. I attached everything: the texts, the pictures, the receipt. Then I typed my final message. "Kimberly, this is for you. Your lies, your betrayal, they've left me no choice. Consider this my goodbye." I hit send. The message was delivered, irreversible. Almost immediately my phone began buzzing. Kimberly's message came first. "Are you insane? You're destroying my life." I didn't respond. Next came her sister, Melody. "Is this real? I can't believe she would do this. What happened?" I let the truth speak for itself. Let Kimberly explain her lies. The facade had crumbled, and there was no piecing it back together. All that remained was the clarity of walking away. Finally, Daniel. Daniel. What's your problem? Why do you insist on dragging everyone into this chaos? He needed an answer. Me. My problem? Let me tell you my problem. You thought you could sleep with my wife and walk away without a scratch? Think again, Daniel. Actions have consequences. I blocked him right after that. The fallout was swift. By the time I stepped through the door at home, Kimberly was on the couch clutching her phone, her face streaked with tears. When she looked up, her eyes blazed with fury. "You've ruined everything!" she choked out, her voice shaking with anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I placed my keys on the counter and turned to her. "Ruined everything?" I said evenly. "No, Kimberly, that was you. You wrecked it all the moment you decided I wasn't enough. I just made sure everyone saw the truth for what it was." She rose to her feet, trembling, her breathing jagged. "I hate you," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Good," I replied. "That makes this easier." Without another word, I walked into the bedroom, grabbed the suitcase I had packed that morning, and made my way to the door. Dragging the suitcase behind me, I paused at the threshold. "You're right about one thing, Kimberly," I said, my voice steady. "I wasn't happy either, but the difference is I stayed faithful." Her face crumbled, but I didn't wait for her response. I closed the door behind me. For the first time in what felt like years, I felt the weight lift. Her lies, her betrayal, the resentment, it was all gone. I didn't know what was ahead, but one thing was clear. Whatever came next would be without her and entirely on my terms. At first, I didn't go far. I checked into a small hotel on the outskirts of town, far enough to gain some space, but close enough to stay grounded. That first night, sleep evaded me. My mind churned, revisiting every decision I had made and the uncertain future ahead. By morning, my phone was lighting up with messages. Kimberly had sent a flood of texts I didn't bother counting. Some were full of anger and blame. "You've ruined my life. Everyone thinks I'm a cheater because of you. You're pathetic." Others tried to tug at my emotions. "We could have fixed this. Please, just talk to me. Let's work it out." I ignored them all. The real shock came from others. Friends, family, even casual acquaintances reached out to share their thoughts. Kimberly's mom called first, her voice fraught with tension. "Is this true?" she asked, clearly hoping I'd deny it. "Every word," I replied, my tone flat. She exhaled heavily. "I don't even know what to say. I'm sorry, but she's still my daughter." I couldn't blame her. Blood ties are hard to break, even when faced with harsh truths. Next was my best friend, Grant, and he didn't hold back. "I never liked her," he admitted bluntly. "There was always something off about her. You deserve so much better." His words left me feeling both validated and hollow. The most unexpected message came from Kimberly's sister, Melody. "I'm sorry you're going through this. If it means anything, Kimberly has always been this way, thinking she could get away with anything. I'm glad someone finally called her out." I didn't reply, but her words lingered. This wasn't just about infidelity, it was about Kimberly's true nature. By the second day, Kimberly had gone silent, but the damage was already done. News of her affair reached Daniel's workplace, and his leave became indefinite. Friends who had sided with Kimberly initially now kept their distance, embarrassed by her actions. I took the next step that afternoon. I filed for divorce. Even after everything, the decision wasn't easy. 9 years of marriage isn't something you can discard without thought. But every choice Kimberly made with Daniel led us to this point. There was no turning back. I had the papers delivered to her that same day. Later that evening, I received a single email from her. "I got the papers. I don't even know what to say anymore. I didn't mean for this to happen, but I know I can't fix it. I hope you find someone who makes you happy someday." It was the closest she had come to taking responsibility, but it didn't matter anymore. My path was clear. As I sat in that cramped hotel room reading her email, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. The anger that had fueled my actions was gone. The ache of betrayal had dulled. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. Kimberly's world was falling apart. Daniel's too. But I was finally breaking away. I had a blank slate, free from deceit and doubt, and I was ready to embrace it. The next day I took a step I hadn't taken in years. I hit the gym. This wasn't the half-hearted attempt Kimberly used to nag me about. It was an intense, all-in workout. Sweat poured, muscles burned, and with every rep, I felt years of frustration and humiliation melt away. Kimberly, Daniel, the betrayal, I left it all behind on that gym floor. That night, back in my hotel room, I picked up a notepad. I'm no writer, but I needed to organize my thoughts. What comes next? Where do I go from here? The life I had spent over a decade building was gone, shattered by her choices. But that also meant I had a chance to rebuild. Step 1. Find a new place. The house we had shared was full of too many painful memories. She could keep it. I wanted no part of it. Step 2. Rediscover myself. I had spent so much energy trying to be a perfect husband that I had lost sight of who I was. What made me happy? What were my passions? These questions were daunting but exhilarating. Step 3. Reconnect with people who truly cared about me. Over the following weeks, I reached out to friends I had drifted away from, relationships that had suffered because of Kimberly's preferences or my misplaced priorities. I had beers with Grant, caught up with college friends, and reconnected with my younger sister, who had always seen through Kimberly's facade. "It's about time," she said as I laid out everything for her. "You've always deserved more than what she gave you." The weight of those words felt different now. In the past, I might have brushed them aside, chalking them up to familial loyalty. But now? Now they rang with a truth I could no longer ignore. While I was beginning to confront those truths, Kimberly was frantically trying to salvage the wreckage of her life. The divorce papers had set off an explosion she hadn't seen coming. Friends stopped taking her calls. Her family kept her at arm's length. Even Daniel, her supposed ally, had vanished. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed with a message from her. "Kimberly, I miss us." I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. The words were painfully familiar yet utterly empty. This was the Kimberly I once loved, the one who always knew how to say just the right thing, even when it lacked authenticity. But the truth was, I wasn't the person who would fall for it anymore. I didn't miss us. In fact, I wasn't sure there had ever truly been an us to begin with. I left her message unanswered, and that was the last time I heard from her. Instead of dwelling on the past, I chose to focus on myself. I poured my energy into work and picked up hobbies I'd long put on hold. Boxing, experimenting in the kitchen, and even trying my hand at photography. Each new pursuit felt like uncovering a forgotten piece of myself. But the most profound change came when I found a new place to live. It wasn't extravagant, a small, comfortable apartment on the other side of town, but it was entirely mine. No memories of shared betrayals haunted the walls. No lingering traces of a fractured relationship hung in the air. It was a fresh start, and it belonged to me alone. I decorated with intention, starting with a photo I'd taken years ago, a sunset skyline bursting with vibrant hues of orange and pink. To me, it symbolized hope and the promise that even after the darkest storms, light would break through. The life I'd once known was over, and for the first time I found that I didn't mind. I wasn't running anymore. I was free, free from Kimberly's deceit, from Daniel's shadow, and from my own self-doubt. And for the first time in years, I was ready to move forward. The months that followed felt surreal at first, like stepping into someone else's life. The absence of Kimberly was noticeable. No more pointless arguments about dinner plans, no more cold silences during her late-night work meetings, no more waking up to her covertly texting someone else. Initially, the quiet unsettled me, but over time it became peaceful. It became liberating. The divorce was finalized quicker than I had expected. Kimberly didn't put up much resistance, leaving most of the legalities to her lawyer. By the end of it, she kept the house, the ring, and whatever remained of our shared life. I walked away with what truly mattered, my self-respect, my freedom, and the resolve never to settle for less again. I'll never forget the day the final divorce papers arrived. It was a rainy, overcast Thursday. I held the envelope in my hands, staring at the bold title, Final Decree of Divorce. Strangely, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. Tossing the envelope onto the counter, I grabbed my car keys and drove to a lake I hadn't visited since I was a teenager. When I arrived, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a crisp, fresh air. I sat on the hood of my car, watching the rippling water. For the first time in ages, I allowed myself to imagine a future, not the one I had once envisioned with Kimberly, but something better, something real. As time moved on, the sharp pain of betrayal dulled into a faint ache, a distant echo of what once was. Occasionally, I'd hear snippets through mutual acquaintances about how Kimberly was faring. Her world had unraveled. Her reputation was in tatters. Her friendships had dwindled, and her relationship with Daniel had fallen apart not long after the truth came to light. Part of me thought I'd feel vindicated. Instead, I felt only pity. Kimberly had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. As for me, I was flourishing. Without the weight of my old life holding me down, I dove into my career, and it paid off. I earned a promotion and financial stability that allowed me to finally chase long-held dreams. I began traveling, ticking destinations off my bucket list. And somewhere along the way, I met someone. Her name was Nina. We met during a photography workshop, of all places, both of us fumbling with our cameras while trying to capture the perfect sunset shot. She laughed at my awkward jokes, and for the first time in nearly a decade, I found myself genuinely smiling. Nina was different. She was straightforward, honest, and she made me feel truly seen. We were taking things slow, but for the first time in years, I felt something I thought I'd lost: hope. Looking back, I don't regret any of it. Not the marriage, not the heartbreak, not even the public unraveling of it all. It taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. I learned to trust myself, to stand my ground, and to never accept less than I deserved. If you're reading this and find yourself in a similar storm, here's what I've come to understand. Don't let someone else's betrayal define you. Don't stay in a place where you're undervalued or disrespected. You're worth more than that, even if it takes time to realize it. Because no matter how bleak things may seem, there's always a path forward. And often that path leads to something far greater than you could have ever imagined. For me, that's exactly what this journey became: a tumultuous, painful, yet ultimately freeing path toward a new beginning. And I can say with certainty, I'm never looking back. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you. Antonio never thought that a single night could change his life forever. One evening, returning home, he found his wife with her boss, and in that moment, his world shattered into tiny pieces. But the blow was even harder when his mother, from whom he expected support, sided with his wife, blaming Antonio for her betrayal. Now, he is alone but determined to start anew and shield his children from this nightmare. Can the betrayal and deception that once broke his heart become a bridge to a new life? This path will be a long one for Antonio, filled with revelations, pain, and perhaps hope. My dear friend, be sure to subscribe to my channel if this is your first time here, and give your royal like to this video. Anthony froze on the threshold, his hands trembling as he took in the scene unfolding in his bedroom. His wife of 15 years, entangled in their sheets with her boss, looked up at him, her eyes wide with horror. They hurriedly separated, scrambling for their clothes, as a thick, unbearable silence filled the room. Anthony's heart pounded wildly, but he forced himself to step forward, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Could this really be happening? His voice, shaky and laced with disbelief, broke the silence, echoing against the walls, heavy with a mixture of shock and betrayal. His wife's boss, Marcus, raised his hands in a defensive gesture as if bracing for a confrontation. Anthony, it's complicated, he muttered, casting a nervous glance at Emma, as if hoping she would intervene. Complicated? Anthony's words came out bitterly, and he fixed his gaze on Emma, searching for even a hint of remorse in her eyes. Emma, explain to me. Why? Why did you do this? Emma held his gaze, her expression cold and unyielding. "I don't owe you an apology, Anthony," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of any regret. "Accept it or don't. I don't care." Anthony's heart clenched, and he took a step back, stunned by her indifference. "Are you really just going to leave? You don't feel any regret? Not even a little?" His voice softened, a pleading note seeping in, desperately hoping to see a trace of the woman she once was. Emma's face hardened even more, and without a hint of remorse, she leaned into Marcus, her eyes gleaming with disdain. "No, I don't regret it. Marcus is different. He's successful. He understands me. He's everything you never were." A crushing sense of weight settled over Anthony. The woman he had loved and trusted now looked at him with open contempt. Marcus's smug smile only grew as he spoke, a hint of arrogance in his tone. "Anthony, you just don't get it. Emma needed someone who could truly support her. If you had been there, she wouldn't have needed to find me." Anthony clenched his fists, his body taut with suppressed anger. "I was there every single day supporting her and our family," he said, his voice breaking with pain, but Marcus merely shrugged, as if Anthony's suffering meant nothing. Anthony turned back to Emma, hoping to glimpse even a shadow of the woman he once adored, but her gaze remained cold and distant. A noise came from behind, and turning, he saw his mother entering the room. Her face was expressionless, her gaze stern as she took in the situation. For a moment, Anthony felt a flicker of relief. Surely his own mother would stand by him. "Mom?" he asked softly, seeking understanding and support. "Did you know about this?" Her expression became even sterner, and she crossed her arms, looking at him with judgment. "Anthony," she began, her voice cold and unyielding, "if you're going to divorce Emma over something this trivial, you can no longer consider me your mother." Her words were as icy as Emma's, each spoken with intentional cruelty. "This is a minor mistake. Any woman could make it. If she was unhappy, you should have noticed." Anthony's shock shifted to a sharp, burning anger. He inhaled sharply, looking at her in disbelief. "Are you serious? You're really blaming me?" Without a hint of hesitation, she replied, "Yes, I am. You let her slip away, and now you're angry because another man gave her what you couldn't. Value your family," his mother said firmly. "Don't destroy it over something as trivial as pride." Anthony's head began to spin. His mother's stance was baffling. It seemed she was siding with Emma, disregarding her betrayal as if it were merely a minor misstep. His gaze darted between his mother and Emma, desperately searching for any hint of remorse or doubt, but their faces showed only calm certainty, as if they genuinely believed he was the one to blame. Emma broke the tense silence, her voice sharp and firm. "If you were even half the man Marcus is, we wouldn't be here," she sneered, casting a look at Marcus and smiling at him smugly, as if expecting a reaction. Anthony clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to maintain his composure. "I loved you, Emma," he said quietly, his voice laden with disappointment. "I gave you everything." But Emma's expression remained indifferent, her gaze cold and unyielding. "Love isn't enough, Anthony. It takes more. Marcus understands me. He cares. He makes me happy in ways you never could. Were we ever truly happy?" For a moment, Anthony was speechless. He looked to his mother, hoping to see even a trace of sympathy or understanding, but she simply shook her head, her gaze steely and merciless. "This is your fault, Anthony," she said in a detached tone. "If you couldn't keep the family together, don't expect my sympathy, and don't even think about abandoning your children without a stable home." A sharp pain pierced his heart as he fully grasped the meaning of their words. His mother and wife had turned against him, placing all the responsibility for their actions on him. He understood. He was utterly alone. "Fine," he whispered, barely audible. With a heavy heart, he left the room, feeling the weight of their accusations pressing down on him, and walked toward his children's room. Despite the storm of emotions, one thought shone clearly through the chaos. His children needed him. He opened the door and looked at them quietly, feeling his heart clench. His daughter lay in her crib, her soft breathing filling the room, while his son was sprawled out, his little hand resting on the pillow. A strong wave of protectiveness surged within Anthony, a fierce determination to shield them from the pain and betrayal that had overtaken his life. Sitting beside his daughter, he gently brushed her hair from her face. She stirred, her eyes slightly opening as he whispered, "Daddy's here, sweetheart. Daddy's right here." She mumbled something, half asleep, and drifted back into slumber, leaving him with a bitter mix of sadness and resolve. This was not the life he had envisioned for them. They deserved more than a home filled with lies and betrayal. Rising, he looked at his children one last time, feeling his decisions solidify within him, unwavering. He knew what he had to do. He would protect them, even if it meant leaving everything behind. As the first rays of dawn began to seep through the house, casting a soft, calming light, Anthony felt the weight of his decision settle over him fully. The silence was almost soothing, and he knew he had to act before Emma and his mother returned. Every second counted. Moving swiftly, he gathered the essentials for himself and the children. In the kitchen, he packed snacks, water, and a few of their favorite toys into a small backpack. His hands moved almost automatically, driven by a mixture of clarity and detachment. The choice was made. He just had to follow it through. He returned to his daughter Camilla's room, pausing a moment to look at her once more as she slept. Waking her was difficult, but there was no other choice. Leaning over, he gently shook her shoulder. "Camilla," he said softly, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "It's time to wake up, sweetheart. We're going on a trip." Camilla slowly opened her sleepy eyes, blinking at him, a slight smile forming on her lips. "Daddy," she murmured, stretching. "Yes, darling," he whispered, feeling a mix of pain and hope swell in his chest. With the first rays of dawn breaking on the horizon, Anthony was already on the move, quietly preparing for a journey to an unfamiliar place. Camilla, still waking up, watched him with mild curiosity. Gently, he handed her a small backpack, carefully packed with love, her clothes, a few favorite storybooks, and her beloved stuffed rabbit. She hugged it close, trying to stifle a yawn. "Will Joseph be coming with us?" she asked sleepily, a note of uncertainty in her voice. The question caught Anthony off guard, and he paused for a moment. Kneeling to meet her eyes, he gently shook his head. "Not this time, Camilla. Just you, me, and your brother." With a warm smile, he added, "We're going on a little adventure together. Sound good?" Camilla thought for a second, then nodded and squeezed his hand tighter. "Okay, Dad," she whispered softly. Anthony led her into the living room where their belongings were already neatly arranged and ready for the road. He then carefully entered Wyatt's room. His 9-year-old son was sleeping soundly, sprawled out on the bed with his mouth slightly open. Gently, Anthony lifted him, murmuring, "Time to wake up, Wyatt." Wyatt's eyes cracked open, unfocused at first, then slowly recognizing his father's face. "Where are we going?" he asked, barely awake, rubbing his eyes. "Somewhere interesting, buddy. Just trust me," Anthony answered softly. Wyatt yawned, wrapped his arms around his dad's neck, and rested his head on his shoulder as they headed to the living room. Anthony set him down, handed him a small backpack, and gave their things one last check. "Are we really going on an adventure, Dad?" Wyatt's voice was barely audible. Anthony knelt down to meet his gaze, giving a reassuring smile. "Yes, we are. It's a place where we can be happy, someplace new. You and Camilla are going to love it." Wyatt looked at him intently, tilting his head slightly. "Are you coming with us too?" Anthony felt a pang in his heart, but nodded. "Yes, I'll be with you, every step of the way." He strapped both kids into the car, took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment, and started the engine. Without looking back, Anthony pulled away, leaving behind the home and life he had chosen to leave. With each mile, his mind grew clearer, as if shedding the doubts and guilt he'd carried for so long. Steeled by his resolve for the sake of his children, he pressed forward, determined to create a better future. The morning streets of the city were empty as they drove past, and soon Camilla and Wyatt had drifted back to sleep, their heads resting against their seatbelts. Glancing in the rearview mirror, Anthony felt a surge of protectiveness. They were his entire world. Finally, he stopped at a gas station on the edge of town. He needed to refuel and gather his thoughts a bit. As he filled the tank, the weight of his decision washed over him, but his determination remained unshaken. When he returned to the car, he noticed Camilla was awake, watching him intently. "Where are we, Dad?" she asked quietly. With a gentle smile, he brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "Just a quick stop, sweetheart. We're still on our way." Her face lit up and she asked, "Can I have a snack?" "Of course," he replied, pulling out a packet of crackers from one of the bags. Handing them to her, he infused his voice with as much confidence as he could muster. "Listen, kids, I know this might feel a bit confusing, but I promise everything's going to be all right. Okay?" Camilla nodded, thoughtfully nibbling on her crackers, and Wyatt stirred awake, blinking sleepily. "Are we there yet?" he asked, frowning and looking around. "Almost, buddy," Anthony assured him, though in truth, he hadn't yet decided on a final destination. For now, the priority was putting distance between them and the life they were leaving behind. The next hour passed with aimless driving. Anthony took random turns to ensure they weren't being followed, and to buy himself time to consider their next steps. By mid-morning, they had arrived in a small, quiet town, stirring faint memories for Anthony of a trip with his parents. The town was peaceful, with rows of modest houses and an unassuming, simple center. He found a spot by the local park and parked, deciding it would be a great place for the kids to burn off some energy and for him to collect his thoughts. "We're here," he said, turning off the engine. The kids eagerly jumped out of the car, stretching and looking around curiously. The park was nearly empty, with only a few early visitors and families with small children scattered around. Anthony took each child by the hand and led them to the playground, where they immediately began climbing the ladders and sliding down the slides with genuine joy. Watching them play, Anthony felt a wave of calm wash over him. Here, in this quiet place, he found a brief respite, a chance to clear his mind, away from the burdens of the past. It was like a small window of hope, a place where he could envision a fresh start. "Dad, look!" Wyatt's voice snapped him out of his thoughts, and he turned to see his son excitedly pointing at the swings. Smiling, Anthony walked over and gently pushed Wyatt, while Camilla took the swing beside him, their laughter echoing through the morning air. After a while, they returned to the car, tired and ready for lunch. Anthony handed them sandwiches and juice, watching them eat quietly. As the day drew to a close, Anthony realized they'd need to find a place to stay for the night. "Dad?" Camilla looked up at him with a concerned expression. "Are we going home tomorrow?" Taking a deep breath, Anthony met her questioning gaze. "Camilla," he said gently, "we're not going back. We're going to make a new home, just for us. How does that sound?" Camilla's small hands froze in her lap, but after a pause she nodded, her face becoming serious. "As long as you're with us, Dad." Wyatt nodded in agreement. "Yeah, the important thing is we're all together." Anthony's heart filled with pride and a bittersweet ache. He hugged them both tightly. "I love you more than anything in the world. This new life, it's going to be better, I promise." Later they stopped at a modest motel, a temporary refuge, while Anthony thought about their next steps. That night, he sat with his laptop, researching possible towns and schools, determined to create a stable future for his children. There was still so much he didn't know, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the kids slept on the motel bed, he watched them, silently vowing to protect them in the life they were beginning together. No more secrets, no more betrayals. A week had passed since the start of this new chapter, and Anthony was already settling into the daily routines of single fatherhood. Then, one quiet day, the phone rang. An unfamiliar number made his heart race, and with a sinking feeling, he answered. "Hello?" A calm but insistent voice replied. "Mr. Hill? This is Nurse Amelia from Medfield Hospital. I'm calling to inform you that your wife and mother were involved in a serious car accident." Anthony felt a cold lump of fear tighten in his chest as he gripped the phone, glancing at the kids who were playing with their toys. Are they okay?" His voice shook. "They're stable," the nurse reassured him, "but they're quite shaken, especially your mother. They're asking if you could come. It would mean a lot to them." She paused and added softly, "This could be very meaningful for them." Anthony sat in silence, feeling the weight of his tangled emotions pressing down on him. A barely perceptible unease flickered in Anthony's soul, a reflexive reaction to what he'd just heard. But soon it was replaced by a surge of indignation, a familiar bitterness stirred by old wounds. Memories surfaced. Those he'd thought were close, who should have supported him, had betrayed him. Even his own mother had sided with Emma, placing the blame on him, and Emma herself, without a hint of remorse or regret. "Mr. Hill?" The soft voice of a nurse interrupted his thoughts, bringing him back to reality. "Will you be able to come?" she asked. Anthony froze for a moment, battling a storm of emotions. Part of him wanted to walk away, to let them deal with the consequences of their actions. But he knew he couldn't ignore it forever, especially now that his children were involved. He glanced at Camilla and Wyatt, who were engrossed in building a fort out of pillows, blissfully unaware of what was happening. They deserved to have their mother as part of their lives, with all her flaws, and he owed it to them to at least find out what was going on. Taking a deep breath, Anthony replied, "Yes, I'll be there soon." After hanging up, he leaned back, feeling the weight of the decision he'd made. How was he supposed to face them after everything that had happened? But he couldn't hide the truth from his kids. Gathering his resolve, he approached them, kneeling down to meet their curious eyes. "Hey, little ones," he said softly, trying to smile encouragingly. "We're going on a little trip." Camilla looked up, a mix of curiosity and worry in her eyes. "Where are we going, Dad?" "We need to go see Mom and Grandma. They're in the hospital right now, but don't worry," he added, aiming to keep his tone as light as possible. "They're going to be okay." Concern flickered across Camilla's face. "Why are they in the hospital?" "There was an accident," he explained gently. "But they're safe now. We're just going to visit them." Wyatt's eyes widened with a mixture of excitement and fear. "Are they hurt badly?" "Not too much," Anthony reassured them, hugging them both tightly. "They just need a little rest, and they'll be fine." During the drive to the hospital, a heavy silence filled the car, with the past creeping closer with every mile. The children were quiet, staring thoughtfully out the windows, as if sensing the seriousness of the situation. Upon arriving, Anthony parked and, collecting his thoughts, led the kids through the busy hospital corridors. The sharp smell of antiseptic and the bright lighting added a cold, impersonal atmosphere. At the reception desk, a nurse directed them to a room at the end of the hallway, and Anthony's heart raced as they approached the door. In the doorway, he saw Emma lying on the bed, her face pale, her arm encased in a cast. Next to her, in a wheelchair, sat his mother, her face softened by an uncharacteristic gentleness despite the bruises. "Anthony," his mother greeted him, her voice unexpectedly vulnerable. You came?" He nodded, maintaining a calm expression. "For the kids," he replied, trying to keep his tone steady, though his voice was cold. "They need to know their mom is all right." Emma turned away, a faint blush of shame coloring her cheeks. "Thank you for coming," she murmured quietly. Anthony's response was a simple nod. "What happened?" he asked, tense. His mother's voice trembled slightly as she replied. "We were coming back from the mall when a car ran a red light. I didn't have time to react. It all happened so fast." She looked at the children, tenderness in her eyes. "I'm grateful you're here. Moments like these, family should be together." A barely visible smirk almost crossed his face, but he suppressed it. "Family?" he repeated with a hint of sarcasm. "Funny how family didn't seem to matter when you told me to turn a blind eye to Emma's affair," he remarked sharply. His mother flinched, and Emma turned away, her face burning with shame. "Anthony," Emma said softly, her voice filled with hesitation. I didn't think it would turn out this way. I didn't think you'd actually leave." "Why shouldn't I leave?" Anthony's voice was cold, each word piercing the silence. "You both made it perfectly clear that I'm the one to blame here. Did you really think I would stay and just accept that?" For the first time in a long while, he saw something new in Emma's expression, a softness, a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I was wrong. I thought you'd stay for the children." His mother cleared her throat, her gaze darting nervously between them, full of uncertainty. "Anthony," she began, her voice barely audible and wavering. "Maybe we were mistaken. I didn't realize it before, but now I see. I only wanted to keep the family together." Anthony clenched his jaw, struggling to contain his anger. "By supporting Emma? By asking me to just turn a blind eye to the betrayal? That's not what family means to me." He took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to his children, who stood by, wide-eyed, absorbing every word. Family should mean loyalty, respect, honesty, the kind of things that seem to have been forgotten here. A heavy silence hung over them all. His mother paled, her face tense with regret, while tears started to fill Emma's eyes. "Anthony," she breathed, her voice trembling with emotion, "please, let's talk. I know I've hurt you, made unforgivable mistakes, but I want to make it right. I can't let our family fall apart." His expression remained impenetrable as he looked at her. "That choice was yours, Emma. I'm just trying to live with the consequences." Emma reached out to him, her voice breaking. "Please, Anthony, don't do this, for the children's sake. They need both of us. I'll do anything to make it right." He shook his head, his face set with determination. "It's not that simple anymore." He turned his gaze to his mother, his tone sharper. "You wanted me to stay with her, no matter the cost to me, to keep quiet, to accept the betrayal. And now you think a few words can erase all of that?" His mother's lips trembled. "Anthony, I understand now. I was wrong. I don't want to lose you or my grandchildren." He looked at his children, at their faces filled with worry and confusion. Kneeling down, he hugged them both. "Listen, kids," he said gently. "Daddy will always be here, no matter what." Camelia's large eyes looked up at him. "Are we leaving, Daddy?" He stroked her hair, smiling. "Yes, sweetheart. We'll go home soon." Emma's voice cracked as she reached for him again, her words full of desperation. "Anthony, please, don't go. I'm begging you. Let's try again. Forgive me. I'll do anything you want." He straightened, his expression unyielding. "Sometimes, sorry just isn't enough." He glanced at his mother, seeing in her eyes a remorse too deep for words. "You both broke my trust. That's not something that can just be forgotten." Without saying another word, he turned to the children. "Let's go, kids. We're going home." As they left the hospital room, he felt an odd calmness. The pain was still there, but for the first time in months, he sensed a quiet clarity. He had listened to them, but nothing had changed. He made a decision, and there was no turning back. Stepping outside, he felt the warmth of the sun on his face, as if it illuminated this moment with a clarity he'd long been missing. Looking down, he saw his children holding his hands with unwavering trust. As they walked to the car, a quiet sense of peace washed over him, a freedom he hadn't even known was possible. His phone buzzed, breaking the calm. It was a message from Emma, her words carrying an unexpected plea. She hadn't reached out in days, and although he'd assumed she might eventually text, he hadn't prepared himself for the wave of emotions her message stirred. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, he sat alone, reading her words over and over, contemplating his reply. Logic urged him to ignore it. He owed her nothing, but relentless curiosity gnawed at him, making him wonder what she could possibly have to say after everything that had happened. In the end, he agreed to meet, choosing a quiet cafe on the edge of town, away from familiar faces. When he arrived, he spotted Emma and his mother sitting together, their faces tense. Anthony paused, assessing the scene. Emma looked exhausted, her face pale, shoulders slumped, eyes cast down at her own hands. His mother, usually reserved, appeared uncharacteristically anxious. When they noticed his approach, relief flickered across their faces. Anthony sat down without a greeting, folding his hands and waiting silently. The silence stretched until Emma finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "Anthony," she began softly, "I made a mistake." She paused, looking away. "I thought I knew what I wanted. But I was wrong. I was wrong about so much." Anthony raised an eyebrow, his tone icy. "A mistake?" he repeated, leaning back and crossing his arms. "Interesting. You once told me to either accept it or leave, that if I didn't like something, it was my problem. Does that sound familiar?" Emma blushed, lowering her gaze, and mumbled almost inaudibly, "I was angry. I thought you'd stay for the kids. I didn't believe you'd actually go. I never wanted it to end like this." Anthony clenched his jaw, trying to keep his composure. "So betraying me was fine as long as it didn't complicate your life?" His voice cut through the tense silence. Emma's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling slightly as she reached them across the table. "Please, Anthony, don't make this harder than it already is. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. I just want a chance to make it right." Anthony's voice grew louder, catching the attention of a few nearby tables. "And how exactly do you plan to do that, Emma? How do you rebuild trust when it's been shattered?" At this, his mother leaned forward, her expression a mixture of sorrow and guilt. "Anthony, I made mistakes too," she admitted quietly. "I thought I was doing what was best for everyone, pushing you to stay with her. I thought I was helping keep the family together, but now I see I only made things worse. Don't push us away. Losing you and the grandchildren, it's unbearable for me." Anthony looked at her, his gaze cold and unyielding. "You lost us the day you took her side," he said firmly. "When you blamed me for her actions, called me a failure, and told me to accept it. That's when you lost me. And now, when everything's falling apart, you think a few words can make it all right?" His mother's eyes filled with tears, and in the silence that followed, the weight of her remorse was palpable. "Now I understand. I was wrong. I thought you could forgive her, that somehow we could restore everything and bring it back to the way it was." Anthony laughed bitterly, an empty sound. "Forgive her," he said. "Forgive both of you for betraying me, for showing me how little I meant to you." He shook his head with determination. "There is no going back. I've left, and the kids are with me too." Emma reached out, her voice trembling. "Anthony, please. I know we can't get everything back to how it was, but for the sake of the kids, can't we try? They need both of us." Anthony's restraint cracked. "Now you're thinking about the kids?" he whispered, his voice quiet but full of rage. "Where was that thought when you were meeting with your boss? When you lied to me, humiliated me in our own home? I was here for the kids every single day, and you threw away everything we had." Emma's hand dropped, and she covered her face, crushed by the unbearable weight of her guilt. She looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Anthony, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am truly sorry." Anthony's gaze was cold and unyielding. "You're only sorry because you got caught, Emma," he said. "If I hadn't caught you that night, you'd still be with him, wouldn't you?" She turned away, unable to answer. His mother reached out, her voice filled with emotion. "Please, Anthony, don't shut us out. I know I let you down, but I love you and my grandchildren. I want to be part of their lives." Anthony looked at her hand, feeling distant. "You pushed me away yourself, Mom. You took Emma's side when I needed you. You made me feel like my pain didn't matter, like I didn't matter. And now you're asking me to forgive that." He shook his head slowly, his voice calm but firm. "You both made your choices, knowing exactly what they meant. Now you'll have to live with the consequences." Emma's shoulders shook with sobs, her pride replaced by despair. "Anthony, please let me make it right. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll go to therapy. I'll change," she begged. "I don't want to lose you and the kids." Anthony looked at her, a fleeting shadow of their love crossing his mind, quickly swallowed by the pain she'd caused. "You lost me, Emma. The moment you told me to accept it or leave, that's when I made my choice." Panic gripped Emma. "But the kids need their mother, Anthony. They need a family." "They already have a family," he said calmly. "They have me, and I'll make sure they grow up in a home where there's honesty and respect, not lies and betrayal." He looked from her to his mother, both pleading and broken, but he felt only a quiet, final calm. "I hope you both find what you're looking for. As for me and the kids, we're moving forward." Emma's last plea came in almost a whisper. "Anthony, I'll keep trying. I'll prove to you that I can change." He held her gaze, unblinking. "You had your chance, Emma, and you lost it. I'm done." He stood up and turned his back to them, letting his final words hang in the silence left behind. As he walked out of the cafe to his car, he felt a wave of calm wash over him. The past, once so heavy, was now behind him, and a future awaited him and his children. Over time, life settled into a steady rhythm, and Anthony began rebuilding it, step by step. His days centered around his children, their routines filling his life with a quiet sense of purpose. Every morning he was the first to wake, entering the kitchen to prepare breakfast, waiting for his sleepy but smiling son and daughter to join him. Laughter grew more frequent in the house, their joy rekindling a strength in him he hadn't realized he could still possess. One afternoon, while his children played in the park, Anthony sat nearby on a bench, watching them with a quiet satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. The sound of his daughter's laughter echoed as she slid down the playground slide. In that moment, he noticed a familiar face. Samuel, an old friend he hadn't seen in 3 years, was walking toward him. They exchanged surprised glances before shaking hands as if those years had simply vanished. "Anthony!" Samuel exclaimed, patting him on the shoulder. "How many years has it been? 3? 4? "Something like that," Anthony replied with a grin. "Life takes us to unexpected places." Samuel nodded, a shared understanding reflected in his eyes. "Yeah, I heard about everything. I'm really sorry, my friend," Samuel said quietly. Anthony shrugged slightly, though now without the bitterness that would have accompanied the gesture a few months ago. "It was hard, but we're managing." They sat together, talking and reminiscing about the past, laughing and sharing memories. Samuel introduced Anthony to friends from the neighborhood, and slowly Anthony began opening up to life outside of work and home. He realized how much he'd missed the company of friends who genuinely cared about him. When Samuel invited him to a small gathering over the weekend, Anthony hesitated a bit. Socializing felt foreign, and he wasn't sure he was ready. But with a little encouragement, he agreed, sensing it was time to reconnect with life. At Samuel's house, he entered a space filled with warmth, laughter, and music. Here were people who valued simple joys and each other's company above all. During the evening, his gaze settled on a woman at the edge of the room, laughing with Samuel. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and he felt a sudden spark of interest. Noticing his look, Samuel approached him with an understanding smile and introduced her. "Anthony, this is Abigail," he said, nudging him forward slightly. "We grew up together. She's been away for a while, but recently came back." Smiling, Anthony extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Abigail." She warmly shook his hand. "Likewise, Samuel's told me a bit about you." "Hope it was all good?" he joked, smiling. She laughed and replied, "Mostly," sparking laughter between them. Their conversation flowed easily, and their connection felt surprisingly natural. They spent much of the evening together, sharing stories, dreams, and pieces of their lives. Abigail's openness and warmth were refreshing. She even asked about his children and his divorce, listening without judgment or pity. In the following weeks, she and Anthony grew closer. She didn't try to fix him or offer sympathy. She just listened, something he'd longed for. They started spending weekends together, watching his children play in the park, having picnics in the sun, and spending quiet evenings watching movies at his place. With her, he felt truly seen and appreciated. One cold autumn night, after the kids had gone to sleep, they sat on his porch, wrapped in quiet contentment, holding steaming mugs of tea. Abigail looked at him thoughtfully and asked, "Do you ever regret anything?" She spoke softly, her voice radiating quiet warmth. He stared into the distance, at the dimly lit yard, considering her question. "Are you talking about leaving everything behind?" he asked, and she slowly nodded. "Yes, everything. Leaving it all behind to start anew," she replied. Anthony's thoughts drifted back to the heartache he had endured, the pain of betrayal, and countless sleepless nights spent in doubt. But soon, his mind shifted to the laughter of his children, to the confidence that was beginning to blossom within them, and to the calm that was gradually filling their days. "No," he finally said, "I don't regret anything. It was the hardest decision of my life, but it was the right one." She reached out, gently touching his hand. "You deserve this peace, Anthony. You and your children deserve it." And for the first time, he felt the truth in those words. Happiness was not just possible. It was something he rightfully deserved. In the following months, his life began to take on a new shape. The betrayals that once haunted him turned into distant memories, into lessons that had strengthened him. His children thrived in their new environment, and Abigail became a steady, comforting presence. One sunny day, Anthony took his children to the park. His daughter was learning to ride a bike, and his son was joyfully swinging on the swings. Laughing, he encouraged her as she tried to keep her balance. And suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed two familiar faces at the far end of the field. Emma and his mother stood off to the side, their faces a mix of hesitation and unease, shadows of the life he had left behind. A flicker of anger sparked within him, but quickly faded. In its place, he felt an unexpected calm. They had made their choices, just as he had made his. Without a second thought, he refocused on his daughter, her face glowing with joy as she finally managed to keep her balance and ride forward. "Look, Dad!" she shouted, her eyes sparkling. "I see you!" he called back, feeling his heart swell with pride. Abigail stood nearby, cheering on his daughter with the same enthusiasm he felt. When their day finally came to an end and they headed home, Anthony felt a profound sense of peace. His life was now filled with real, meaningful connections, surrounded by people who genuinely valued him. Laughter and the warmth of love were all around him, and the weight of the past had finally lifted. Emma and his mother remained on the outskirts of his life, but he bore no bitterness. He hoped that they too would find their peace, just as he had found his. Later that night, as he tucked his daughter into bed, he noticed her sleepy eyes looking up at him. "Daddy, are we happy now?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart," he replied, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face and smiling. "We're very happy." He kissed her forehead and closed the door. As he stepped into the hallway, Abigail approached him, taking his hand. They walked into the living room and sat in quiet contentment, savoring the shared silence. The past was behind them, and ahead lay a future full of possibilities he had never dared to imagine. Challenges would come, but he knew he wouldn't face them alone. He had built a life rooted in trust, respect, and love. And looking at Abigail, he felt a deep certainty that this was only the beginning of the happiness he could now rightfully call his own. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.